Today I'm going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution slash the rise of big business and its consequences. The first Industrial Revolution in the United States. The Industrial Revolution refers to an extended period of economic change beginning in 1750 and continuing on to the present, in which people invented new machines and new systems for producing goods on a mass scale for mass markets. And this production of goods was primarily carried out in factories. The first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, new methods of production were created by the British and were adopted by others. This was known as the First Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution really began in Britain. The textile industry was the first industry to be revolutionized. Inventions such as the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and the power loom transformed the speed of production, which led to a lot of profit. Now on to the development of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Northeast merchants were eager to compete with British industrialists. They were also encouraged by Hamilton and his economic policies. The U.S. had three resources that gave them a big advantage versus other countries who were trying to industrialize. The first advantage was a lot of land slash raw materials. They had a lot of labor and also a lot of capital. Northern merchants already were used to risking capital to maybe make a profit. And finally, the US also had a patent system which spurred more inventors to invent in hopes of making money. The Second Industrial Revolution in the United States. The Second Industrial Revolution refers to the 50-year period between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I. This was a period of tremendous economic and industrial growth for the United States. The main catalyst for industrial growth during this period was the Henry Bessemer process. The Bessemer process made it easier to mass produce steel. By 1900, the US produced more steel than Britain and Germany combined. Mass amounts of steel being produced also fed other forms of industrial growth. For example, better steel meant better railroads. Rapid expansion of the railroad system also allowed for transportation of raw materials and finished goods around the nation. And by the end of the period, the boosted production and reduced prices created a consumer economy which demanded new and innovative products. Here are some major areas of growth during this period. Number one, transportation. Pre-Civil War, most people relied on canals, roads, and rivers to connect the West and the East. Railroads revolutionized transportation and united the U.S. For example, the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869. By the end of the 19th century, the West had more railroad tracks than all of Europe combined. Steel. Pre-Civil War, U.S. mostly used iron, but post-Civil War, the steel industry boomed, mostly due to the Bessemer process. Again, the Bessemer process made it really easy to mass-produce steel, which would lead U.S. to becoming the leaders of steel production in the world, and they actually made 13.5 tons in 1901. Another area of growth was energy sources. Rapid industrialization led to a greater need for coal, and oil wells were founded, which led to digging becoming a big industry, as it was a relatively clean fuel for home lighting. And electricity was used for the new light bulb and the new telegraph and telephone. Now on to communication as a major area of growth. In 1837, Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, which used Morse code to transmit messages, and thousands of miles of telegraph wires connected cities. After the war, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and by 1900, 1.3 million telephones were in use. Expanding national and international markets. Better transportation due to railroads meant better production of nationwide goods. Goods produced in the East were shipped to the West, and meat and wheat products in the West were shipped to the East. The Second Industrial Revolution led to even more global trade. Imperialism increased railroad building and the shipment of consumer goods throughout the world. Merchandise industry also grew. Department stores popped up, which led to shopping becoming popular to the middle class rather than just the rich. And the Montgomery Wall's catalog system allowed for people in rural areas to mail in their orders and get them shipped to them. Corporations and the rise of monopolies. By 1900, the main form of business went from partnerships and proprietorships to corporations. Corporations were businesses which were chartered under state law. It was hard to raise money in a partner/proprietorship, as the partners and proprietors were liable for all of the debts of the business. To raise capital, corporations would actually sell stock to the public. If corporations were to go bankrupt, the stockholders are not liable for paying debt, unlike partnerships and proprietorships. So basically, you can only lose what you put in, and this is way safer than the past forms of business. Capital concentration consolidation. Here's some background. Remember Adam Smith's theory of laissez-faire? He said that this was the surest way to economic progress, and it was to allow businessmen to compete freely and without any government restriction, but there was a flaw in his theory. If left freely, businessmen would actually try to eliminate any forms of competition, we will discuss soon. In 1870s and 1880s, in every industry, businesses were gearing towards the creation of monopolies. The rise of big businessmen, Rockefeller and Carnegie. John D. Rockefeller. He founded Standard Oil Company, and he created a monopoly in the oil industry by aggressively buying out struggling competition, convincing railroads to give him a portion back of the railroad shipping charge, and eventually building his own pipelines to eliminate any shipping fees at all. Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was an immigrant from Scotland, and he worked hard to eventually build his own steelworks in 1870. He was extremely smart with his workers and investments. For example, he was one of the first steel makers to invest into the Bessemer process. Carnegie did all he could to lower production costs, such as bargaining with the railroads for lower shipping. Eventually, he sold his company for $500 million in 1901. Big businesses and shady practices. Railroad companies try to suppress competition through pooling. Railroad companies that used to compete actually joined forces to dictate railroad prices depending on the markets. And they usually charged rural areas a lot more since the rural people had no other choice but to use that railroad since there was no other competition. Rockefeller came up with the idea of trusts. A trust is a super corporation made up of competing firms. Trusts started to pop up in most industries, and they influenced lawmakers to pass laws that were favorable to big business. In 1890s, business leaders came up with the idea of holding companies. A holding company is a company that had the sole purpose of holding majority stock in different firms so that they could establish common policies in the industry. Businesses also often cut wages and had workers work in bad conditions to lower production costs. Government and big business. Abuses of large-scale industries and monopolies led to demands of the government to take action to break up big business and limit growth. However, the Supreme Court actually broadened the 14th Amendment to include corporations, which actually meant that they received the same protections as individuals. The government did try to control trusts, especially through the Anti-Sherman Act in 1890. However, it was actually super ineffective because it was very vague. But at least it established the principle that the government should try and break up monopolies. And here is a famous Supreme Court case, U.S. versus E.C. Knight in 1895. E.C. Knight and Company owned more than 95% of the sugar refining industry. The government tried to break it up, but the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not break up the sugar monopoly since it was not considered interstate commerce. Here's a chart, changes in business and industry. So changes in organization of businesses and advancement in manufacturing. During the Age of Jackson, which is 1825 to 1845, we have growth of textile mills and increased number of corporations. Mid-century, let's just say 1845, sorry, 1845 to 1865, we have the Bessemer process. And post-Civil War, we have the standardized oil trust and a trend toward bigger and more consolidated business firms. And some inventions in transportation and communication. In the Age of Jackson, we have the first locomotive and the telegraph. Then mid-century, we have first oil pipeline and the laying of the transatlantic cable. And post-Civil War, we have the cable streetcar in use, the telephone, and the phonograph. And some inventions in agriculture. During the Age of Jackson, we have the reaper and the steel plow. Mid-century, we have mowing, threshing, and haying machines. And post-Civil War, we have the giant combine harvester and thresher and the corn shucking machine. Now some labor responses to economic change. National unions started to form due to the violation of labor rights after growth of big business and industries. The first national union was the Knights of Labor, but that ended due to a riot where the Knights were falsely blamed for extreme violence. The second big union was the American Federation of Labor in 1886. They were focused on more bread and butter issues than King's, such as higher wages, lowering work hours, and better working conditions. The big difference between the Knights and the AFL was that the Knights included all genders and races, while the AFL was heavily segregated. And indeed, African Americans would actually just take the place of the AFL members when they went on riot. Since the AFL was segregated, women actually started to create their own unions, such as the National Women's Trade Union and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Unions versus companies. Worker strikes were extremely common in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and many of the strikes ended up becoming violent. First, with the Homestead Strike in 1892, which is one of the most violent strikes in U.S. history. Steel workers um, went on strike against Carnegie's company, and the state militia actually had to end up breaking up the strike. The steel union was crushed until the 1930s due to the strike. And now we have the Pullman strike in 1894. Pullman reduced the wages of the workers by 25%, but he actually didn't lower rents or groceries in Company Town. Railroad across the country stopped handling Pullman carts, which led to a delay of mail. So Grover Cleveland had to arrest the leaders, and the railroad union was actually broken up. The Lawrence Strike in 1912, the industrial workers of the world went on strike against the American Woolen Company, and the state militia had to be called as always. But they did win higher wages and no punishments. Most Americans approved of military use to break up strikes. They saw strike leaders as revolutionaries trying to undermine traditional values. The government in the 1800s consistently sided with businesses over unions.